I'm holding one of the most fascinating books I've ever read, an exquisitely written autobiography that explains how Sir Anthony Hopkins can walk into a room under pressure and make Shakespeare, well, Hopkins makes Shakespeare sound like Hopkins has opened a vein and just lets the glorious words of the bar come shooting straight at you from his bloodstream, directly out of the veins. And inside this autobiography, Hopkins admits some things, a couple of things actually, that most people would probably never guess about him. And we'll get into those things. But when it comes to this channel, Hopkins' ability to learn his roles really blew me away, because it's not really about talent in some fundamental way. It's definitely not about photographic memory, which I've debunked before on this channel. All things told, it's not even really about acting, which might surprise you, or at least it's not about acting as such. Hopkins has a very private ritual, one so obsessive it looks a little bit like madness, which is why I had to give it a try with some Shakespeare myself. You know, the technique that Hopkins talks about ultimately revolves around a single, tiny little mark. This is where things get really interesting before we get into the nitty-gritty of that tiny little mark. By trying to copy the way that Hopkins says he learns his roles, I learned a very, very fundamental lesson that I wasn't expecting. You know, I set out to answer a question that every intelligent person eventually asks themselves, which is, why can't I remember things as good as Anthony Hopkins? You do ask that, don't you? Well, what happened during my experiment, it really blew me away. I was not expecting the outcome. And it's a lesson that exposed a trap that ruins learning and memory and performance and confidence for so many people. So today I'm going to share my experience, somewhat embarrassing experience, of trying to copy Anthony Hopkins so you can avoid that trap and still memorize whatever it is that you want, even if Anthony Hopkins' process isn't quite right for you, because it wasn't right for me. But it's especially important that you have some kind of process for absorbing lots and lots of material. And, you know, another thing about Hopkins that really blew me away that's so important is that a lot of people think of him only as an actor, which just simply isn't true. What I discovered in this book is that he's a true polymath. He's skilled in multiple areas. And, you know, he's someone who needed to learn some heavy lessons in life that are also really worth knowing about. Lessons about fear, about confidence, and the need to see past the fickle movements of the untrained mind during moments that the mind often exaggerates in importance. So I hope that you can learn through what I'm going to share with you today how to train your mind better, move past so much unnecessary suffering, and stop leaving so much of life's pleasure behind. And we're going to look at it through the lens of memory, because Hopkins is a master of many, many skills, but memory is at the core. Now, Hopkins underplays a lot of his many talents, but the photographs also tell a different story, showing a person conducting an orchestra and painting, and that's just on top of all the epic Oscar-winning roles that he played. But according to Hopkins, he was hardly a childhood prodigy. As a schoolboy, he felt stupid, constantly behind and endlessly in fear of being exposed. He literally called his report cards from school death warrants. And then something really interesting happened to the young Anthony Hopkins that set one of the themes that would govern much of his life and is a learning and memory lesson as well. He tells a story about staring at a teapot on a counter in the kitchen and thinking, what if I smashed that patterned teapot on the stupid counter to smithereens? Cause and effect. No teapot, no school report, no school. No me. No me. That's not just a dramatic thought. It's a young mind discovering something important, something primal. If I can control something real, I can control what happens to me. And if I am not there at all, well, You'll see. Hopkins started using this insight to build later what he called his tin brain box. And he used this tin brain box to help him memorize lists of facts from Arthur Mee's The Children's Encyclopedia. And he wrote out lines of Tennyson by hand over and over again. And he also carried a notebook from his grandfather that he used to jot down facts like a commonplace book. And when his mother once asked what Hopkins would do if she disappeared, he said his words fell into that tin brain box of his and it stayed there, locked away like life savings you would take to a bank. Now, on the one hand, you could say that the way young Hopkins starts treating memory with repetition, writing things over and over and over again and repeating the voices and the words that people use around him is like OCD levels of bad. However, as a person who memorizes a lot of material myself, there's a positive spin to that willful repeating of information. I mean, obviously, there's a positive spin. Hopkins went on to be knighted and win 2 Oscars. So if your mind feels like you forget things the minute you read it, nothing sticks, you watch videos and absolutely can't remember what was in them, well, Hopkins' solution is not more intelligence necessarily, it's building. And it's using a mental container and essentially developing a way to make your memory operate like a safety net instead of a sieve, which is, of course, what I focus on teaching people to do, and that's why I'm so interested in his book. Now, I use a very different memorization process than Hopkins describes, and I gave his approach the good old college try. It just didn't work for me, but it does share a bit of an OCD-like characteristic to it that I think you can benefit just by trying what he does, and also you can benefit by trying what I do. But when it comes to the specific skills involved in acting, and I have done a little bit of acting myself, there's a really interesting contradiction in what happens with Hopkins that I've experienced, and it has to do with this know me. And if you've read this book, The Victorious Mind, you know I've had this experience of emptiness myself and memorized a lot of Sanskrit to get it. Emptiness. Now, why would that be so fantastic? Well, it's one of the things that Hopkins ultimately becomes kind of famous for early on in his career, being able to disappear inside of a role. Yet the interesting thing is that the emptiness is built by becoming full first. And that's a huge part of how anyone can carry entire worlds of information in their minds. But it's a mistake to reduce Hopkins to this actor with great memory because the emptiness shows up in these other skills. The emptiness is part of how he was able to direct his own films. He understands story from the director's chair from a position of emptiness. He's a painter, not a dabbler, but someone producing work with real intensity and volume from emptiness. He's a musician and someone who can hold the structure and the feeling and the timing of music to the point of conducting an orchestra. And now he's a highly skilled autobiographical master with the reflective clarity and the ability to spin sentences that usually only arrives after a lifetime of disciplined attention. So the fullness comes from emptiness, and the fact that it's so polymathic should interest us all, because the polymathy is not really coming from talent. And the science I'm going to reveal to you in a minute is incredible, and anyone can achieve it. This emptiness and this ability to learn multiple topics to a point of mastery comes from having a learning engine that works for you across multiple domains. And the important thing here is to understand that Hopkins says he has no technique, and yet he does in a very real way. He has a process, that's for sure. And it works with the precision of a surgeon. And you know, speaking of surgery and things in the brain, he once said that he must have been off his head to choose acting. He said a little microbe curled up in the bowels of my brain and it had convinced me that I could make a living at this acting game. Well, that microbe is very interesting because it's not a delusion. It's something that has to do with the fullness and the emptiness. And as we'll see, it has to do with a method. In any case, Hopkins trained himself to literally be able to walk into multiple kinds of artistic environments and through relentless study, come to know exactly what's needed to act, to perform music, to paint, to direct a film, to study, to sit down and write a stunning memoir. And Hopkins describes it like this when it comes to acting, and this is a very important image to build in your mind. He said, becoming familiar with a script was like picking up stones from a cobblestone street, one at a time, studying them, then replacing each in its proper spot. Only then could I look out over the road and know every inch of it spread out before me. Hold on to this image of the road and lifting up each stone. Fullness, emptiness. And speaking of appearing roads that are full and empty, if you've ever felt left behind, scattered, or like your mind should work better than it does, hit that thumbs up for the love of memory and get to subscribe to this channel if you're new here, because our community is all about getting together to build the kind of mind that can walk into high pressure environments and still perform, spilling out whatever it is that you need to speak in any situation. And I want to show you what Hopkins does to make that road appear full and empty at the same time, and then show you what I did to try to reproduce that. But I was able to do it without reading the script 250 times like he does, which I think is an amazing, amazing process. It's just not for me. But first, let's talk about why Hopkins advises people to approach their skills with emptiness. He literally says, remain empty, don't think. And I know that can sound mystical, but it's not. It's neurological. So, what do I mean by this being scientifically sound? Well, as I talk about in The Victorious Mind and how I got to be able to have long periods of time without thinking, it's a bit of a contradiction, because how are you going to memorize an entire script with no thoughts when actually the script is composed of words with thoughts? Well, there's a logic to this. And there's a part of Hopkins' autobiography I'll never forget, because it's something that I tell my students all the time. And it's just a weird thing to say. So what it happens in the book is, at some point, Steven Spielberg, the director, saw an Anthony Hopkins painting, and he asked Hopkins about his style and his technique. And Hopkins said, I don't think about it, because thinking too much kills the painting. Now, scientifically, what Hopkins is describing in this instance and throughout the book is the shift from the default mode network of the brain to what's called the task positive network of the brain. So the default mode network is where we ruminate, obsess, rehearse our identity, I, me, and we worry about how we look, and we talk ourselves out of the courage that we need to take action. Whereas the task positive network is where you execute. You actually take action without thought. And that's what I tell my students all the time. You're thinking too much about, for example, the memory palace technique. You want to memorize all of the sutras of the Buddha, or you want to memorize the Dirac equation in physics, or whatever it is you want to memorize. Learn the techniques, but don't think about them while you're using them. Another way of thinking about this task-positive network is entering what the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow. He very famously called it flow. And this is that beautiful state where you finally stop narrating your life, blah, 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 blah. You stop commenting on everything, and you stop those nasty little critical statements that say it's not good enough, or you're not right, or this is bad, and blah, blah, blah. And that repressive, destructive filter that smears the beauty of it all, it can stop. And this is where I found how Hopkins absorbs his scripts very, very interesting, because they wind up looking like the ravings of a lunatic. There's some notes on the pages, but mostly there are drawings, circles, and lines. And then there's one tiny mark that is repeated until the page looks almost unrecognizable, which is a star. And he sometimes goes through a script up to 250 times, maybe more. And this is the part there I tried to race with Sir Anthony Hopkins, like making a little star. After just going through it, making little drawings, circling things, lines connecting to things. And it was a bizarre experience. I put aside my own tried and true method, the magnetic Mary method. It was interesting to put it away for a while and to work at what Hopkins is describing in his book. And although it didn't work. It wasn't even pleasurable with Shakespeare, because normally I like reading Shakespeare, but 250 times and drawing little stars and making circles and drawings, I mean, I can memorize this quite quickly. But because it didn't work, it led me to discovering something else that I wasn't expecting. But before we get to that, here's a mystery about memory that I find very interesting and is worth popping into the ether, so that in our task positive network transference, when we stop going blah, 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 we have something interesting to consider as part of this task positive mystery of how the brain operates. So Hopkins talks a lot about his past struggles with alcohol. And those are some of the most painful passages in the book for me. But he noted that he would have conversations with other actors who were drunk. And later, not himself and not the actors that he was acting with would remember the time that they spent together acting on set. They would literally say, hey, we were in that movie together, weren't we? Yeah, but they won't remember it at all, the entire experience. So this is a very strange thing, right? Because Hopkins always knew his lines when he was on set, even when drunk. So how can somebody be intoxicated, remember Shakespeare perfectly, but not remember anything about the day of filming itself? Well, there's an answer. Basically, it comes down to this. Alcohol disrupts the hippocampus and impairs the formation of new episodic memories. And episodic memories are the timeline of what happened and when. But deeply drilled material, semantic words, proceduralized ways of delivering those words, well, that becomes automated, and it remains accessible to one level of memory, while a completely different level of memory is failing to record new information as it comes in. So an actor's preparation can be so strong that it bypasses the conscious state. It's hauntingly beautiful in a way, even if there's a tragedy and a sadness to the alcohol part of it. But drunk or sober, Hopkins' technique remains the same. It's literally going over these texts again and again with a little piece of the puzzle I'll add for you in a second. But it's really, really important to note that this grinding repetition is not robotic. It's sensory. And this is where I found reading between the lines a technique. So Hopkins says at one point, I say 2 lines of Dylan Thomas and suddenly I can smell the warm bread in my father's bakery as if an oven had just been opened in the same room. Well, that's interesting, right? Because Hopkins is making an entire road appear and a bakery happens to be on it, and the sensations of smell come. So that is using memory techniques. It's multisensory association that turns experiences into triggers and vice versa. And that scribbling on a page and making lines and drawings is part of it. Fantastic. But myself, I ultimately found, well, I'll get to this, what I did. It's a little bit embarrassing, but interesting for you, I'm sure. Back to this fullness and emptiness and the ability to pull a road apart. There's another interesting passage where during the recent, at least recent when I'm recording this, the Los Angeles fires, Hopkins' house was burned down. The home contained irreplaceable material from his life. And at least as he reports it, and I don't disbelieve it, he just shrugged and said, well, no worries. I guess we'll just drift around and be bums. Now, you might say, well, that's a bit of denial. But I think that's actually a man who has moved his wealth somewhere that the fire can't reach, into the tin brain box. Where the real wealth, and the only truly important wealth, resides, your memory. Which brings me back to this challenge that I took on. So I didn't ever actually read a page 250 times. I honestly just gave up. It's just too much. But I tried drawing circles and thinking in a multisensory way of how to do this without a memory palace, without the other elements of the magnetic memory method, the magnetic modes, and recall rehearsal. And I didn't see how I could do it for a page, let alone an entire play. But that led me to an idea, which was a different kind of experiment. And it's something that people have asked me to do for a long time, which is to record myself memorizing something, to show the process. But when I did this, I tried it, I found that I had no tin box to crawl into. When testing myself, just showing the alternative to Hopkins, I chose Titus Andronicus, a particular passage, partly because it's brutally unforgiving, but also I was thinking about the disruption that our world is going through right now and how we're losing certain things and how we're gaining certain things. And there's a part where tragic things have happened to members of Titus Andronicus's family, and he just starts laughing. And his son, Marcus Andronicus, says, "Why are you laughing?" And Titus says, "Why, I have not another tear to shed. Besides, this sorrow is an enemy, and would usurp upon my watery eyes and make them blind with tributary tears. Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? For these two heads do seem to speak to me, and threat me I shall never come to bliss, till this mischief be returned again, even in the throats that committed them." And I did memorize it. Is it word perfect just then? I don't know. But I wound up memorizing it in my own way off camera, because when I tried to turn the act of memorization into a performance for you before the camera, timing everything with a stopwatch, turning it into a "look at me" moment, this quickly became very distracting, and it broke the spell of using the magnetic memory method. So I'm not a memory competitor. I have competed, and I did okay when I was at competition, way better than I thought I would do. But I had cameras on me then, and a clock was on me then, and it was just like really, really difficult. And it was not fun, and I've never gone to compete again. So I was finding myself having zero fun recording myself memorizing those beautiful lines. So I went back to my normal self. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how it compares to Anthony Hopkins. And I don't care about documenting the process, because that's trying to act a version of memorization, which is for me deeply private and very quiet. And I became empty and full again, and I rapidly memorized these most enticing lines from Titus Andronicus, and I was myself again, which was to have no self at all, but to bring Shakespeare directly into a place where it could live inside of me. But instead of me thinking about how I look on camera while doing something I came to really dislike because it was on camera, well, I couldn't make it look real, the memorization process with the camera on, because it was not real. Then, during my launch of Vitamin X, the live training we held for people who got it during the special launch, I wound up reciting that selection I just said to you there with my eyes closed for my students, but I did it forward, I did it backward, I skipped the sentences forward and backward to show them the recall rehearsal part of the magnetic memory method. And the people told me, wow, that really helps us understand better how that you do your process. I drew the memory palace first, and basically I just made the entrance like this, and then I had aisle 1, aisle 2, aisle 3, and then one of these kinds of aisles, and then another aisle. And that's basically what this speech required. Now, I'm getting a little tired, so forgive me if I botch this, but it starts, this is how recall rehearsal works. You go forward, then backward, then you do the middle to the beginning, the middle to the end, and then you skip the stations. So it starts like this. I'll just do it forward. "Why, I have not another tear to shed. Besides, this sorrow is an enemy, and would usurp upon my watery eyes, and make them blind with tributary tears. Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? For these two heads do seem to speak to me, and threat me I shall never come to bliss, until this mischief be returned again, even in the throats that committed them." Okay, so that's forward. Easy enough, right? If only. But backwards, okay, so let me do it again. So here's station 1. "Why, I have not another tear left to shed. Besides this sorrow would be, or the sorry, that besides this sorrow is an enemy, and would usurp upon my watery eyes, and make them blind with tributary tears." So for some reason, I actually went this way twice. Normally, I would actually zigzag back and forward, but I'm going through the aisles, right? Then I just jump on over to this aisle. "Then which way shall I find revenge's cave? For these two heads do seem to speak to me, and threat me I shall never come to bliss until how did it go again? Sorry, I'm getting tired. It's hard to talk about it and do it at the same time. And then even in the throats. Oh, until these mischiefs, yeah, until these mischiefs be returned again, even in the throats that committed them. So it looks like a bit of jumping around. It's not possible to like really show. But to do it backwards, what I have to do is start here. Even in the throats that committed them. And then till these mischiefs be returned again. And then and threat me that I shall never come to bliss. For these two heads do seem to speak to me. Which way shall I find revenge's cave, and make them blind with tributary tears? And would usurp upon my watery eyes? Besides this sorrow is an enemy, why I have no tears left to shed, right? Okay, so that's backwards. Now, what I then do, in order to get it into long-term memory, is I start around about the middle. So the middle to the end and the middle to the beginning. So the middle is, then which way shall I find revenge's cave? For these two heads do seem to speak to me, and threat me I shall never come to bliss, until this mischief be returned again, even in the throats that committed them. Then I go to here, and then the middle of this part, or the middle to this area, is, and make them blind with tributary tears, and would usurp upon my watery eyes. Besides this sorrow is an enemy, why I have no tears left to shed. Okay, so that's full recall rehearsal. Now, all the lines were there, thanks to the magnetic Mary method. Clean, controlled, 100% my own. And that's when I realized the trap that I almost fell into, making speed this seductive metric. It feels like progress, and it might feel entertaining for people to watch it. But in art with real learning at its core, speed can amount to nothing more than vanity. And vanity is the enemy of depth. So what I learned from Hopkins in all of his achievements is that success does not have to be fast, and in the real world, it rarely is. What success needs is for skills to be installed as deeply and with as much time and care and consideration as it takes for you to pick up every stone in that road and examine it and put it back again. Because once something is installed following the process of examination, then you have performance and you have presence in your performance because your comprehension is there and it has deepened and woven together with your presence so that both the comprehension and the presence is fully alive. This is the lesson that hit me so hard. Beautiful. You don't memorize a role to prove you can remember words. You don't act. You don't have to fake anything. You can just get it done the way that you get it done and then finally show up and tell the truth. So the ultimate lesson from Hopkins' autobiography isn't about acting. It's about self-acceptance earned through craftsmanship. After decades of defiant willpower, of fighting to prove that he wasn't stupid, Hopkins looked back at that little boy and he says, "We did okay, kid." It's beautiful. And I want you to hear that in a very, very specific way. Because if you feel behind, you're not broken. If you struggle with focus, you're not defective. If you've been measuring yourself by how fast you go or how slow you think you are, you're using the wrong yardstick. Use the positive tools of memory, repetition, structure, focus, and use it to get into that task-positive network of the brain where there is no space or time for the negative loops. There's nothing there that has anything to do with doubt or rumination or fear. Make your little tin brain box and make it properly, and you'll earn the right to be empty and have space for fullness like you never imagined that will make you feel completely free. If you want help making whatever you're called to learn stick in your mind faster, and you're interested in the kind of techniques that I use, then go to magneticmarionmethod.com/YT, sign up for the free course. The link is also in the description below. And it might not be for you, but the learning experience itself will give you some things to think about. The exercises will help move the memories that are already around in your brain so that you can have more memories in the future that are better and stronger just by going through the motions. And you can become the kind of person who can carry a mind and a life through any kind of weather. Now, speaking of extraordinarily successful people who push through extremely challenging weather, if you want to know some more hacks that will help you develop higher levels of mastery right now, check out my video on the polymathic poet who taught himself impossible skills next, because it's very, very inspiring, and it will give you tips that you can actually use immediately. So, thank you so much for tuning in. Get memorizing, and until we have a chance to speak again, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're new here, and keep yourself magnetic.